Welcome, everyone. Are we audible? We sound audible. Yes. It's a great pleasure to see you all here, and we're here really in a significant way to celebrate this book, Art and Religion in the 21st Century, this being Jewish Book Week, and this being a rather fascinating book, authored by the man on my right, Dr. Rosen, who's my colleague at King's College London, where he's lecturer in sacred traditions and the arts. And I'm Ben Quash, and I'm professor of Christianity and the Arts at King's. And Erin and I together helped to run something called the Centre for Arts and the Sacred at King's, whose acronym is ASK, or ask if you're from the north, or ask if you're from where Erin's from. So it's a good way of positioning people as well by giving them this acronym to pronounce. And on my left, I'm really delighted to introduce Lenny, who's one of the artists featured in the book, and whose work you can see upstairs if you haven't already, one of whose works you can see upstairs, and we're going to see several more in the PowerPoint that we're referring to in our session today. And I don't know if you want to say anything more about yourselves.
Well, I was just going to say that, I always say I never need a microphone, so it's very dangerous with my kind of voice. I was going to say that we're actually here to celebrate Lenny. So, and Lenny and I met at the very tail end of preparing this book, and in many ways, actually Lenny's not in the book, which is but I've been telling everyone she is, kind of, but to my credit. And there was many works at the end. I thought, ooh, if I could have just extracted that and slid Lenny's work into it. But we collaborated recently on a project called Stations of the Cross, and I've been doing some very curious things for a Jew, including doing a pilgrimage through London of 14 different sites. And the idea is to try to get people to experience the Stations of the Cross and the iconography of the Passion in different ways from different religious and cultural backgrounds. And I think that's really brought out very nicely in the final station, which Lenny has done, which is at Temple Church. And so if you can see, as you go into Temple Church and you see the space in the round with all of the effigies, if you walk upstairs in to what's called the Triforium, I've been learning lots of new interesting ecclesial architectural terms during this project, then you'll see Lenny's work, and I won't sort of ruin the surprise, but it's had some very dramatic reactions, showcasing both the goodness of humanity and its utter pedantry as well. So,
well described.
Yes. So I would encourage you not only to have a look at Lenny's work for Jewish Book Week, but also at the same time to look at the works for Stations of the Cross. Do you want to say a little more, Lenny?
Maybe I'll say something about you. Aaron is an amazing person. No, my name is Lenny.
Just a little louder.
My name is Lenny, and I'm an artist, and I'm doing my PhD at the Slade. And this is it. Let's talk about something.
Well, we'll come to some of your works, and we would love to hear from you about some of the inspirations behind them. Mm-hmm. And this is to anticipate part of what we'll talk about when we come to your work. I think part of what I would like as a banner over this session is just the simple word "as," that sense of the analogical relation between things, which seems to me to go to the heart of some of what artistic practice can achieve, the making of links which are not identical but somehow explore affinities or continuities, but also difference. And in particular, when we come to the question of religious traditions and their potential to draw from one another in order to express themselves, which I think is a key feature of what Erin's book explores and displays, and in some ways also a key feature of the stations themselves. The very fact that Lenny's work, as the final one of these 14 stations, is in the Temple Church, and that the Temple Church is a deliberate liturgical and architectural evocation of Jerusalem, that it is in a sense it is London as Jerusalem. This translation, this sense of a city translated in certain respects, is already a kind of sign for us of what can be achieved, and it can often be controversial, but what can be achieved by these analogical connections and non-identical repetitions.
It's funny, the Temple Church is such a great example as well, because you have something which is, as many people know, built to resemble the circular features of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which itself, one could argue, depending on to whom you're speaking, I think probably in this audience, very safe to say, possibly not where Jesus was actually buried. So it's something that becomes representational, which is then repeated as to sort of summon the topography of Jerusalem into London by the Knights Templar, but also at the same time the circular form evokes the Dome of the Rock, which was mistaken by Crusaders as the Temple of Solomon, so and represented in Christian Renaissance paintings as such. And so you have all of these levels of duplication. So I think it's a very nice theme to open with, this concept of replication in similarity and difference, sort of functioning constructively and sometimes abrasively.
Right. And part of the stations themselves is again a kind of translation. So originally what was putatively the route that Jesus took to the cross through the streets of Jerusalem with its various stopping points becomes reproduced as people, probably initially having gone on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, Christians came back to wherever their home towns or cities were. They then wanted to recreate this sense of a progression. And so they set up equivalents or analogies to the stations, sometimes across a city, but more often within a single ecclesiastical building. But again, these are all, as it were, analogical representations of an experience that they had, or at least heard about before. The other thing I think that would be nice to keep in mind more generally as we discuss various particular works today is the question of, and I think the stations that Aaron has curated again raise this question, the difference between works of art that are about religion and works of art that are religious art. And my sense, and you may have your own views on this, I'm particularly interested to hear from you about this, Lenny, that contemporary art and the kinds of norms and conventions of contemporary art are very permissive of art about religion. This is something that's positively fostered, often celebrated as interesting, sometimes provocative, and illuminating. But the moment something looks like it might be religious art, in other words, adopting or inhabiting a particular religious tradition, there's a new kind of nervousness about it. Somehow it might sound pious or proselytizing or preachy, and at that point, suddenly the kind of mainstream contemporary art establishment backs off. So I think one of the things that would be interesting to hear about in relation to the works that you chose for the book and the work you do is, do you regard it as art about religion or religious art? I don't know whether you want to respond to that.
Yeah, maybe now, maybe later.
Now.
Now, all right.
Do it. Especially when you do a crucifixion and some of these. Actually, I think maybe I have the ability to
You have
bring
the power.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's go to, let's actually go to one of Lenny's works here on the right.
All right.
By the way, next to a work I really don't respect on the left. But Lenny's work on the right. So when you do something like this, do you, Sleeping Madonna, do you think of this as?
Well, I take it not as a non-religious idea or concept. I look at it as an iconography and a way of telling a story, like a storyteller. I look at the work of art as a storyteller. And for me, I just try to see how the role of the artist was so central in creating a convention, social convention around the very basic themes like birth, death, relationship between male, female, and God, and later on with the state. And for me, I just take it as in a very psychological state rather than a religious point of view.
Because that's interesting, because on the one hand, you could say that you're when asked about something with explicitly religious iconography, say, well, no, it's really about something fundamentally human and about existential questions.
Absolutely.
So then one could then take that and extend it and say, oh, so really this is actually deeper in a religious vein. So it's these asking existential questions with a religious tenor.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is just a way for me to use, when someone see this Madonna and a child, when someone just, go to the church, see Madonna and a child, everyone knows the story, everyone knows the narrative. You just need to see a mother and a child, and you know exactly what's going on. And for me, it's very easy to take this icon and just to have it as a starting point. And what I do, and this is part of my practice, I call it time expansion. I go back to the past, to the art history, and I stop there and I try to expand the time and to create another narrative and expand the discourse around this narrative. So if the Madonna and the child, the mother always have to be beautiful and submissive and, just act ideal, just to be ideal. Well, I can't do that. I'm not this type of mother or this,
yeah. Well, that's why I think it's interesting in your piece for Book Week, right? Is that this is rather the opposite of the generally sort of demure, retiring virgin. And oftentimes she's looking sort of askance, and I think in this way that sort of calls into question whether there's something coercive about her reception of the Holy Seed and her impregnation. But she's sort of very coy, that she doesn't really want it. But to have it, and it's having something that you've presented where you have yourself, partially nude and with your arms sort of upraised, flexing.
Yeah, this is just the opposite then from Madonna and the child. But also it's a very, very vulnerable place because, we're naked, very frontal in front of the camera. There's also a dialogue between male and female, even though it's a mother and child. The scales are quite, ambiguous. So I think I'm not trying to point correct and incorrect or try to judge what happened in the past or masterpieces. I'm just trying to expand the discourse around those psychological states or convention that had been created along the history. And I think there are still some kind of an endless chain that because they are so ideal, like no one wants to challenge a masterpiece. This is perfect. We must not touch it.
So when I saw the Sleeping Madonna at the Jewish Museum the first time, and this video piece, the thing that immediately fascinated me and engaged me was the recognition of that, the fact that this is not an ideal situation as Western art delivers it to us. It's much more recognizably that of propping your eyes open in the middle of the night, trying to deal with a child who needs feeding. And I speak as a man who hasn't, therefore, had quite so much sleep deprivation, I think, probably, but as my wife. But the fact of the honesty about motherhood, whilst you nevertheless frame it in this classical Renaissance way, it's got the sort of purity of line of a Piero della Francesca, and the way you're dressed echoes that sort of unlikely luxuriance of the Virgin's clothing, all of which was designed to indicate her status as the Queen of Heaven at the same time as the perfect mother. So your subversion, if you like, of an ideal that isn't easily recognizable is really interesting, not least because a lot of the time people point to images of Madonna and child and say, this goes to the heart of an absolutely universal human experience. Right. But actually it doesn't a lot of the time because it's not recognizable. So you, in a sense, you play with the claims to universality of those images, but you make them more recognizable and relatable to because of the fact that you're going to sleep.
Yeah, and I think it came from a very personal way, even though it's a very universal discourse. It came from this, maybe I can just reveal some of the process of making. So I took this video, maybe, it wasn't a video in the beginning, it was a painting, and then it was a photograph, a still photograph. And then after I tried to do my best, to hold my baby. And then I tried, the viewer will see his face, but he will also, eat properly and everything. And it didn't work out. It didn't work out. And then I told my photographer, can you just press the video? And I just breastfed him until we fell asleep. And this was the most natural way that me and him knew. And after that, I just realized this is what happened. This is, if the Renaissance and all the classic paintings try to capture the ideal moment, which is, completely fake.
Well, that's what's really interesting then, is that it's when you say that your work is about time expansion, that time expands in different directions, right? So you both go back into the past to recover something that's meaningful to you in the present and hopefully to audiences in the future, but at the same time you have that very small but very powerful time expansion of just setting that narrative moment of the iconography of the breastfeeding Madonna, and just expanding that by 2 minutes is enough to already sort of critique something about it. That yes, it's easy to sort of believe in that sort of demure, opalescent perfection, as long as you don't extend it for more than 1 second, right? And as soon as you do that, you say, no, this is something consummately physical, this is something tiring, exhausting, and you enter into that world of someone who's a mother. Yeah.
So then, to come back to the as question, why choose a tradition of Christian, and specifically in this case Renaissance art, to create analogies with? Why go for that particular tradition?
Because I felt this is the root of the problem. This is where it firstly created, and since then, people just go back and, I don't know if this is the right word, but reproduce, this, because this is so perfect. So no one have the guts, maybe, to say, well, actually, I really don't identify with Leonardo da Vinci's Madonna. If it's so perfect, but no one have the gut to say, well, I can't, I'm not this type of mother. So if I'm not this type of mother, with which work of art, with which masterpiece can I relate to? And I was looking for something like that. I opened books. I'm like, okay, I must find some kind of mother's representation in art that I can feel relate to. I couldn't find it. Yeah, and I couldn't find it.
There's been a great media storm this week, or the last 2 weeks, about this Facebook movement to identify and post images of perfect motherhood, and everyone nominating each other or themselves with photographs of themselves being the uber mum, and everyone else feeling inadequate. And so it shows that the kind of pressure to do this is still very strong in society,
I think
and
it's very
demoralizing.
I think it's a social taboo.
Yeah.
It's a social taboo, and I think the role of the artist is really important in shaping society. I think art is getting less and less recognition in the ability of having an impact on society, but I think it began there, and maybe there is a chance to change it through the art. And
So do you think then it's important that, kind of coming back to Ben's question, why choose this image, and why alter or tinker with that? That in some ways, to go back to a time when there was a more canonical sense of things, where there was a roster of applicable images, or whereas now it's like we're sort of doused in iconicity, right? That and as you with this kind of Facebook campaign, everyone wants to instantly become their own icon, and then they measure it by their likes. And as Facebook rolled out this week, now you can dislike something, or you can be angry about it. You can have an angry face, but within that sort of within that sort of hailstorm of imagery, what can we go back to if we want to make a profound statement? So there, on the one hand, one answer is to do this aggressive pressure for new, and then the other, I think, possibly a more sagacious move is to go to do what you do, which is to say, let's trace back and pare back what a lot of that imagery out there is reacting to, are some of these fundamental archetypes, maybe.
Maybe.
We could look at some other archetypes.
Yes, let's.
Yeah.
This, for example.
This
do
is,
you want to say?
these are all videos, so it's a bit hard to see what's going on. But in this video, the food is sliding down slowly from the table. And my son was in the middle. You'll see him growing. Now he's nearly 6. So he was really surprised by this, gravity thing, like what is going on. And it's called the Last Supper. And it's, again, I think it touches the very two polars of the very personal and the very universal moment. And
how did you make the food move, Lenny? I'm always interested in these kind of things.
I will have to
Is
kill
it
you after.
Little strings, or what is it? Yeah.
Magnets under the table. No, is that
Maybe.
Because a lot of it's about, in a way, because like a lot of what you're doing is a sort of truth in medium and exposing that, when you have the Madonna, that you are drawing the archway and, and you're calling attention to it as artifice. So I wonder in this whether...
Well, I will tell only you.
Only in this lecture.
Only in this lecture. Yeah, it's magnets. It's all analog, and we're pulling the magnets under the table.
But this image, I don't know whether this is in your mind, but it reminds me of the Caravaggio Last Supper in the National Gallery.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
The fruit bowl is famously falling off the front of the table almost, and you feel this desire to steady it.
Yeah.
But the sense also, the food kind of escaping, and escaping into our space, or a sort of distanciation between the figures at the table and the objects that almost break the boundary between the picture and us.
And
but also the fact that you put your son in the position of Christ.
Yeah.
What were you thinking?
Is he always Christ? He never shows up as like Judas or Peter or any of. He's always Christ, right? Yeah.
Well, no, I think now I'm trying to play with it more, just to swap position, roles and everything. But this is the Holy Family, or just mother, son, and child. This is so basic, so elementary. This is like the core of human beings. This is the very core family structure, which is also some kind of flesh and bone, Father, Child, and the Holy Spirit. And
well, and it's interesting. I remember the priest who married my wife and I said that he didn't understand, and this was quite the kind of confession you get from Church of England priests, in my experience, which was always, I have thought, so nice compared to what I grew up with. But it said that he didn't understand the Trinity really in his ministry until he had a family, until there was 3 of them, and he said, and then he understood a principle of something being in triplicate, or of the sense of variation.
No comment.
Yes, I know. I think Christologically that might be a little bit dangerous, but it's interesting. And also what it means to inhabit that kind of iconography and respond to it from, I think, the comparative freedom of being Jewish, right? And that's, I think, one of the things that often is sort of dogged Jewish artists is to say, but it's so constraining. You have to go back again and again to Christian archetypes, and there's such an undeveloped sense of Jewish painting before the middle, or possibly a little of the early 19th century, if you count Moritz Oppenheim and people like that, but that you have to go back to Christian precedents, but rather to say, actually, Jews might have the freedom to engage with that and not say, okay, well, we have to see something as Trinitarian in an Orthodox perspective, but maybe we see it just as 3 people, so.
I think also, the Jewish people are people of word, not of visuals. So we don't have really an option if you want to go back to history and learn from art history.
Do you agree
as
with that?
Jewish?
Well, it's funny because I sort of earn my bread sometimes trying to argue the opposite. So but like all opinions I hold them both like very vocally, but not very strongly. So I would say on the one hand, there's been this very dangerous sense that Jews are anti-iconic. And oftentimes it was very prominent in the 19th century as art history was sort of growing up as a discipline, because you had primarily German art historians saying, well, the Jews don't have a proper nation, so they can't have proper art, which then became a very convenient sort of straw man to say, but we do have a nation, and we have this, even as that sense of nationhood was actually being cobbled together. So Jews were very useful in that. So there's a lot of reasons why people have always wanted to say that Jews, as it were, don't have imagery or don't have art. And the other irony on top of that is that sometimes that's in fact, often been the case because Christians didn't let them. So it was, you don't have art. Like, right, because you don't let us apprentice in anything. You can't show your works. You can't have, a visible facade in many regions for a synagogue. Things had to be built back from streets, and Jews themselves wanted to build things that would not catch the attention, because there's a famous example of a synagogue in Toledo which was done very sort of elegantly and opulently, and an inscription by the person who had donated the money for it saying, I believe this rivals the Temple of Solomon and these kind of things. And so actually Peter the Cruel from Castile then found out about this, went to visit, and said, where did you get all this money? Said this is too good, and he tortured him to try to find out his secret storehouse of wealth. So historically, there was a lot of reasons why Jews didn't want to do things that were very obvious and very visual. And so I think on the one hand, we can say that there's these constraining practical factors, and on the other, we can say we have to admit that that there's not, for these reasons, there's not the same level of Jewish visual art. And now we're going back with discoveries in antiquity, and we find things like Dura Europa, and then you can say, oh yeah, well there were these kind of frescoes, there were these kind of images, which again though remained unknown for so long. So I think we're beginning to sort of change that, but I think one of the things that's so interesting is that already, right from the mid-19th century, as soon as Jews had a relative amount of civil freedom in Europe and could train, they started doing it in vast numbers. And Paris was just full of Russian Jews who creating images. So there clearly was this desire, even if it wasn't there. But it's a problem, right? I mean, so at the one hand, people might look at this and say, but why don't you use Jewish examples? Or have you done anything with, well, you did the sacrifice of Isaac.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to ask you, like, show me one binding of Isaac from the 15th, 16th century, and let's debate it or talk about it. But I couldn't find really.
It's all in manuscript illumination is the time that you see this. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and which is just not very well shared. And then sometimes because of the prejudice that existed that said Jews didn't create visual art, even when there was explicit examples that were found, like the Sarajevo Haggadah from around the middle of the 14th century, you had art historians for the first several generations who were arguing no way this could have been done by Jews. Clearly they commissioned Christians to do it. So even when there have been Jewish examples, oftentimes we've not identified them as Jewish examples. So
this is very interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Because when you have the freedom to tell the story or to say the narrative, but because you have some pressure and convention, you choose to tell the same story, even though you come from a different background. This is something I think also happened to women, like female artists in the Renaissance.
Yeah.
Even though they had their free will, free choice of whatever they wanted to paint, but they chose to paint the same narrative as the male artist, then I think, it's something to consider.
And I guess part of that had to do with who was commissioning it, and so all those issues of patronage and so on.
It's so much politics around it.
One issue is we talk about this tension between universal themes, birth, death, motherhood, fatherhood, and so on, and the particular religious inflections of those themes that we might get, for example, in the history of Christian art. One question that interests me is, and it's a live debate, actually, amongst, for example, social anthropologists, about whether those kinds of experiences are, as it were, first universal and then reflected in religious art, or whether the traditions of not just visual art, but even literary art and so on, that as it were, mediate those human experiences back to us, also construct the way in which we relate to birth, death, and so on. In other words, for example, it's been argued that some of these images of Virgin and Child, or indeed of the crucifixion, or at least the Pietà, when Mary receives her son back, and your 14th station is very much in line with that, are already educative of compassionate response, which you don't need to, which you can't assume is a sort of default human position. In other words, the idea that we are naturally going to be compassionate in situations like that, and especially when we look at other parents and children, isn't to be taken for granted. And that part of the reason we've discovered ourselves culturally capable of compassionate response is partly because we have this art. So it's not that it's first universal and then we depict it, it's that we depict it and we learn responses that are contingent and historically transmitted.
I think the Pietà is a very interesting, maybe icon.
We have that, don't we? Yeah.
I don't know.
There.
All right, this is one Pietà. All
Yeah,
right.
we have yours. Yeah.
So I think the Pietà created just after the Black Death in Europe, and death was all over. Mothers holding their dead children in the street, like you can imagine, like terrible imagery, like life imagery, and then. I don't know, it's something I'm asking myself, during my research. Exactly what happened then that the church created this icon of, again, the submissive mother, the archetype of bereavement, which is non-hysterical, which is completely, how do you say, without emotion, without any emotion.
Often, impassive or,
super passive. So what did they have in mind when they asked artists to represent this moment in such a way? And for me, it feels almost like trying to make some order in the, in the society. They don't want to see crazy women running and shouting, yelling in the middle of the street.
Which is where the Catholic Colvitts sort of Pietà, where you have the mother just devastated and naked, and in the context of First World War imagery is such an explicit disavowal of that, isn't it? You're right, that there's that kind of stability, and even architecturally, if you look at the structure of those Pietàs, there's this pyramidal perfection,
So there is some kind of conscious decision of how to represent women in this particular moment. And I think this is something that went since the 14th century in Germany, when they first created, until today, when you see bereaved mothers holding their photos of their dead children, in journalism. It's like almost staged completely the same as the Pietà. They're sitting on their sofas in their home, holding the photograph instead of the body of their child. And when I see those two images from now and from then, I think that nothing has changed in the way women are asked to react to the loss of their child or to the sacrifice of their child. And so this is something that, this is a video which constantly changes. The mother is like almost sacrificing her son.
Yeah, it rotates like a clock face. So
she loses the child. Each one is an independent, character in this situation. So I'm not saying how we should represent bereavement, but I'm just I just want to expand a bit this moment and to ask, do I have to sit like this? If something like that will happen to me, will I sit like that? There is no way.
When in
There
a way
is no way.
you both restructure and destabilize that moment at the same time, right? So one was set to, and so I really recommend people see this piece by Lenny, because as you see, I mean, at first it seems to offer almost like a deck of cards, a variation that you can have, that you have the mother holding the child, but then it's that the bodies become unified, and sometimes it looks like they're like equal signs, or they're a hyphen, but at other times, because of the kind of rotation that you did and Yali's dimensions that you stretched, it's as if the two rotate off balance, off kilter with one another. So there is this kind of sense that it's not just that everything becomes cyclical and that it reassures, but it also it offers a panoply of things, but you're also worried it sort of spins out of control. And it seems to me that's what's really powerful about it. There's that chance that something might be completely upside down. And so you take a very sort of literal idiom, and by embodying it, you have that sense of, a very different experience of loss and complete disorientation. Yeah.
I've just realized I said Caravaggio's was the Last Supper, and because this is being recorded, it's the Supper at Emmaus. Okay, so sorry, and everyone who might or might not watch this later, I'm just concerned the art historians might jump on me.
Well, actually, that with you bringing up the Supper at Emmaus, I mean, that was really telling with Lenny's title, the Last Supper, because the Supper at Emmaus is it's the do-over. It's again that kind of thing
supper
of
after
as
the
a
Last Supper,
replication.
right?
Yeah.
Right. Just to come back to this broader question of art about religion and religious art and the difficulties of policing that boundary, I think there are interesting analogies between that distinction and something that's happened in the transition from modernism in art, and particularly kind of that high modernist agenda that quintessentially we might associate with abstract expressionism, which had universal ambitions, almost religious. I mean, the sense that you might find an artistic language which crossed every boundary and was delivered with a kind of instantaneousness and monumentality somehow, and a certain kind of simplicity. And we can think of the obvious examples. I mean, Rothko is somewhere in the PowerPoint, isn't it?
Yeah, it's right there. It's on.
Oh, it's on there. So thank you. Perfect. So that sense of almost quasi-religious ambition to speak across every boundary and all at once to people with this, and one of its interesting effects is it creates work that evidently suits contemplative response. People really do spend time with some of these works, and then but yet they're somehow, and this is to borrow someone else's way of putting it, Katie Kresser in Seattle, that somehow it's noun-free. So the particularities of people and their experiences are abstracted from this kind of art. What you get then with a lot of contemporary art is the return of the nouns, and people artists speaking personally, and also inviting their audiences to invest themselves unapologetically personally in the work, sometimes by actually adding to it or contributing to it themselves, interacting, becoming conscious of their bodies, their histories, their location, and so on. And that's, if you like, not so much an art of monumental plenitude as encounter and development and often decay. Do you think there are religious grounds for preferring one type of art over the other? Or should there be both? I mean,
well, maybe a question within it, a question within a question within that question to Lenny would be, if you feel that in some ways there was that question of, well, I go back to these Christian archetypes because that's what's there that represents these type of experiences. If you were to be looking through the canon to find Jewish exemplars, one of the first places you would go, of course, would be to the abstract expressionists. If you're trying to do, even though they had very ambivalent reactions to what it meant and interpretations of what it meant to be Jewish, Rothko said he'd be delighted to do a chapel, but he'd be damned if he would ever do a synagogue. And he used to make fun of people who did synagogues, actually, including Adolf Gottlieb in particular. So do you ever feel that sense that you could look for some of that material, even if it's less specified? You could say that there's a specifics of the personal encounter with that work. James Elkins makes the, I think, hard to demonstrate claim, but he makes the claim that more people have cried in front of Mark Rothko's paintings than any other major modern artist. But you could look for a sense of emotional encounter and perhaps find in abstract expressionism. As an artist, why is it that you sort of gravitate to those figurative moments, or what is it that you might find as a deficit when you look at these abstract works?
And not just figurative, but really personal. I mean, familial. These figures are your family.
Yeah.
So.
A lot of pressure on
Sorry.
that. Tell us, do you like Rothko or not?
Yeah, I love Rothko. No, but I think for me it's very important to say things very clear. There are enough people that make abstract, and there is room for everyone and for everything. But for me, I feel these days, coming from the Middle East, with, horrible fights, making art for me is a really strong tool of expressing and raising questions. And if you are just the very personal way, I can't do it with abstract paintings.
But if you bring in that identity, you have an opportunity to, as you said, say something more specifically, but you also have the opportunity to be misread more specifically, right? And so I wonder, and maybe this is a question that might come up in the discussions as well, is there's a lot of labels that people do or don't want to take, and one of the things we began with is someone a maker of religious art, or are they a maker of art with religious subjects? Mm-hmm. But what about, is someone a Jewish artist or someone an Israeli artist? And both of those become differently charged ways of thinking of oneself. So what would be your reaction if someone said, "Oh, so you're a Jewish artist? I get it. You're doing Jewish stuff. You're a Jewish artist." What would be your anxieties, or what would be celebratory about that?
I think no one will call me a Jewish artist. Israeli, yes, but not like. All right, the audience can see this, but no one will call me a Jewish artist.
This one.
Yeah.
Oh, because so for me, but of course, I'm married to someone who's training to become an Anglican priest. So it says something about my Jewishness. Yeah. But to me, we have this on our mantle. So to me, it's a very Jewish image, because Jews have always wanted to re-engage in these very, I think, again, as I said earlier, maybe freer and more creative ways with the crucifixion. But you call this Jesus of the jeans, and I think so. On the one hand, you're wearing blue jeans, and there's this critique of this bourgeois sensibility of Americans always taking photos of with them in their blue jeans and white t-shirts or something for family picnics or something. But there's also a sense that it's Jesus of the jeans, that it's a sense of a community built not as Christianity is out of belief, but a community built out of blood and viscera and relation in that way. So to me, it's well, I'm not saying anything about. It's obviously it's untrue that my Jewishness is not resonant from this. All right. Yeah.
And it's again about sacrifice and growing in Israel and having a little boy, and the clock is ticking until it will be 18, and all of this. Embedded in this image. But do you have any reactions differently? Obviously, saying you're an Israeli artist in Israel is a little different than saying you're an Israeli. Just being frank about where you come from and what it is that you engage with, and like you said, very profoundly, I think this idea of the clock ticking, of institutionalized sacrifice, something that Adi Ness, another Israeli artist who does a lot of photography inspired by canonical Christian images. Mm-hmm. That sort of coded in there. Do you ever feel that there's something possibly that
that worries you about seeing as an Israeli artist in England? Does that sort of change, do you worry about people's perception of your work or how they'll read your identity into it?
I think people are curious. And they get the amount of anxiety I carry with me as an Israeli, as a Jewish person. The DNA of the anxiety is just all over. So they get the amount of anxiety of my work, and they ask, why aren't you doing something nicer,
We've promised the last 15 minutes to you for questions and answers, and we've reached that point. So this is an opportunity. Please, but put your hands up, and starting here maybe, and then here. We have a lot of hands. Please.
All right, my question is about Hans Feibusch. Because Hans Feibusch was born Jewish. He went to...
Oh, sorry, I should have said, if you could wait for the microphone to come, yeah?
Okay, thanks.
Because posterity wants to hear you.
My question is about Hans Feibusch, who was born Jewish in Germany, came to England, attended church, did an enormous number of murals in churches above the high altar, and then when he died, he was buried next to his wife in the Jewish cemetery in Hoop Lane. Do you have some comments about his path, and also the fact that in his murals, the pictures of known Christian figures were actually members of his family?
Well, I was going to say, you probably know the Feibusch in Chichester Cathedral better than I do, because I remember seeing it a few years ago. But I think, what's interesting is that's just such a terrific example. I'll speak less art historically to those particularities, because I haven't researched them in depth. But I would say that the kind of dilemmas that you sketch out run across a variety of different artists, and I think it's the problem that's faced by so many Jewish figures in general, which is, to what extent does your self-identification matter in contradistinction to whether people decide you're Jewish? And I think one of the things we've seen historiographically is that there's been a very dangerous tendency to want to go looking for Jewishness in a way that purports to be positive, but really is just a negative. It is really just an inversion of fascistic logic, that Jewishness is somehow lodged in people's blood, and that they can't help but doing, and it's usually guised in something. Donna Cuspit does this a lot by saying, it's the Jewish unconscious that's sort of working its way out in this. And so I'm always very frightened of those kind of arguments. What I would say is that I think I always like to take the biography of the artist as an opportunity, but not prescriptive. And so in this case, someone who's working within a Christian context from and who has been identified as Christian, we can read, what we still might do is say, maybe there's some sorts of conflict there, maybe something can be brought out of that, but I think it really interesting in terms of the imagery of the family. And I think that's something where in a way the biography of the artist becomes part of the art. And I think it's best to see it in that light, and to see that it opens up opportunities rather than foreclosing it. And one of the things I talk about in my first book, Imagining Jewish Art, which I don't recommend to buy because it's way too expensive, but is that I say that Chagall is involved in this act of sort of fostering a family, that for Jews, oftentimes the relationship to art history and the relationship and identification as a Jew have these kind of unexpected resonances and parallels. And so the way, for Chagall, he says, the only one who can understand me is Rembrandt. Rembrandt is my father. And it's that kind of artistic, that taking a Jewish relationship and mapping it onto the history of art, or taking an art historical relationship and mapping it onto Judaism, I think is a very fructive way to combat, I think, really facile ways that we often hear about Judaism as only a relationship of blood. So I always think we can also imagine blood relationships. So I would like to think that that kind of interpretation might have some play with fibers, but I would be afraid to overstep my knowledge.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything? Should we move here?
I'm going to risk saying something terribly, terribly simplistic that I haven't nevertheless heard this afternoon, although I've heard some simplistic things. But the simplistic thing I want to raise is the whole question of idealization. Religious art is about idealization. The Madonna is an idealized woman. What I'm not clear about you is whether you wish to attack the idea of idealization, which seems to me very important as humanity is becoming an urban species. And the problem with it is that idealization, as we see in the Middle East, is a nice example, excellent example of this, how dangerous it is. Are you trying to attack idealization in general, or is it you don't like some of the particular idealizations that, say, the Catholic Church is rather fond of? In other words, do you want to construct a different idealized woman, or do you want to get away from the idea of an idealized woman altogether? In which case, if you want to do the latter, an interesting subject to try and draw would be the fact that in countries like ours, a decreasing proportion of women choose to have children at all. And there's an interesting response to the Madonna, perhaps. I know how you would draw it, and also to draw the woman who has postnatal depression. She's said to be mentally unstable, but maybe not. Maybe she's realized what a heck of a problem she's taken on having a child. How about that? Maybe she's a bit more sane than some of the people who try and treat her.
Thank you. That's definitely to you,
There's
Lenny.
a lot, yeah. There's a lot there for you, Lenny. So I think that maybe that we could take. I know. I was just setting up primarily what I thought might.
Ooh. Well, I'm not trying to attack anyone, first of all. And yeah, it's all about idealization. And for me, there is no such a thing, ideal woman. And what I'm trying to do is just to suggest other narratives beside, without canceling or dismissing the masterpieces or, the perfect mother created by the church, for the church. I don't care. I'm just trying to create other narratives that will sit along with the known narratives of ideal woman.
So you're happy to accept church idealizations if people like them?
Well, I'm not happy about it, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't deal with that. But it exists. And unlike maybe Le Corbusier, who said, all right, Paris is a terrible city. Let's erase it all and build a modernist city. I don't look for erasing my past or others people's past. I just recognize the past as it is, and also recognize the past as something that influenced my existence and my presence. And what I'm trying to do is to add another layer to this and suggest other, or to just expand the discourse around those moments.
A question at the end of the row.
From the art historical point of view, do you feel, and this is really addressed to all three of you, that the development of Jewish artists was greatly hindered by the virtual prohibition of representational art in the Ten Commandments? And perhaps you can enlarge this question a wee bit by saying that does not the same prohibition apply to an even greater extent in the Muslim religion? Because they have an even greater horror of anything representational of living creatures in their art. So do you feel that, in other words, it held back the development of Jewish artists historically, not to have this prohibition in the religion?
I think that's one for Aaron initially, although it's interesting that Christianity could have gone that way and nearly did in the 8th century. So the arguments made for the retention of images were finely balanced, actually. But that's another story. And Aaron, you
well, I'm feeling sufficiently chastened, so actually, why don't I ask it as a question to Lenny, which is, do you find that the second commandment, do you feel that you're often judged by that standard, or that comes up, that's just something that it's a kind of a baggage that Jewish artists have to deal with? Or do you feel that that's just something that doesn't enter into your practice at all?
I think each artist just choose what to deal with. I don't know. Yeah, for me, this is my, the resources are just the everyday life. So.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I think that the majority of the Jewish artists I've ever spoken to have just said, it doesn't really come into my work very much at all. And I just read a book by a Jewish artist who wants to claim the second commandment is entirely about time, and it provides him with intuition about performance art. So so you've had people using it creatively as a source or inspiration for their work. But I think even from what's interesting to me is that already from the 19th century you had Hegel on the one hand denigrating Jewish artists and saying they can't even visualize their God. What is this sort of dearth of creative potential? And you have Kant in a rare moment actually celebrating that aspect of Jews. So you have, in a way, often I think it's that the discourse around the second commandment has been something that people from Christian perspectives have wanted Jews to be responsible for, and almost want them to be better Jews than Jews want themselves to be. So I think really, and if you look back in antiquity, you had Jewish images of the zodiac. You actually had Jews creating images of pagan gods. So for most of Jewish history, it's actually not been operative. People have always looked at it contextually and said, does it pose a danger for idolatry? I think it's a very interesting question to apply that to Muslim artists. And by and large, I found that there's more fear and anxiety about that question, of course, surrounding Islam. But I think, unfortunately, we've oftentimes lost a sense of multivocality in Islamic art history and in Islamic identity more broadly. So we just expect Islam to have one thing to say about this. And I think really through history, actually, there's been a plenitude of Islamic images. And sometimes there's a discussion about public versus private. So Kaiser Amra, something discovered in the modern period, there was frescoes where you had a tremendous amount of royal scenes. You actually had drinking, you had shooting things. So you had sex, you had all of this, and you even have images of Muhammad in Islamic miniatures from Persia. So actually, we think that, but I always wonder whether, as a Jewish art historian, I always worry, am I doing something to Muslim artists that Christians have always done to Jewish artists, where they say, no, but surely your tradition says that. Yeah, so I think people are less constrained on the ground than they expect.
Yes, please. This may need to be our last, I'm afraid.
We've talked about the idealization of the woman in the classic Renaissance pieces, whether sculpture or painting, that show the Madonna feeding her child or the Madonna grieving over her child. But then I think if you go back maybe pre-Renaissance to Giotto and you look at the women in his frescoes, their mouths are open, their eyes are squeezing out tears, their bodies are racked with distress. So there's a much more physical display of genuine human pain and how it distorts the human body. And maybe, do you think that the classical images have kind of eclipsed that? You talked about its effect on us as people. Maybe we've absorbed the Renaissance pieces because they were more comfortable to take, and we couldn't take the more physical human representations as in Giotto.
Maybe in Giotto, one of the most famous moment, I always forget the name of the theme, when it's just after Jesus were taken off the cross.
Deposition.
The
Lamentation.
yes, thank you. So you see the angel above, and they are devastated. Really, they are tearing their heads off. They are crying into their cups. They are really devastated. While Mary is there, holding Jesus, her son, and yes, she's more maybe emotional, but not as the angel. You know, they see everything from above, and I think in this particular fresco, maybe this is the beginning of this. I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the word, but when the woman asked first to step out of her own emotional state, and you see it so strongly only because the angels are there to represent to represent the bereavement, the pain.
Yeah, it's funny about when things become more emotionally real or more illusionistically real. And I think it's interesting that for so many modern artists, they've wanted to go back to the Trecento, or they've wanted to go back sometimes even earlier. And one of the great inspirations for the Rothko Chapel was a Last Judgment scene in a mosaic. I think there was Trecento in Torcello, Italy. And so he felt that he wanted to take that sort of this real sense of horror and judgment and import that into an abstract image.
I'd just say that don't forget the Northern Renaissance is really different than from the Italian. So the emotional kind of octane levels of the North remain very high, even if they seem to come calmer in the Italian Renaissance.
And some of the things that we've lost, like the wood sculpture from Germany in the 1500s, and actually just again in the Stations of the Cross vein, the work that's in the Tower of London, Guy Reed has a very haunting. Unclothed self-portrait of himself as Jesus, which is carved in lime wood in the same material as the great German Renaissance carvers. Yeah. And so I think that kind of materiality also beckons you back into kind of some of the grisliness of life.
Yeah. I'm very sad that we're out of time, but Lenny and Aaron are going to be whisked upstairs to a book signing place. And that will give you an opportunity to continue to converse with them and maybe buy a book if you're not rushing on to something
Or you could buy some of Lenny's art,
or her art.
I mean, that's a bit better use of better investment. So.
But thank you for your attention. Sorry we didn't have time for more questions. And let me invite you to thank both of them.
Thank you, Ben.